I want to turn now to someone who's worked closely on the Afghanistan issue, did so in the last administration, did so when we first went back in the first part of this century. It's former National Security Advisor John Bolton, former Ambassador to the United Nations as well. He joins me now. Ambassador Bolton, it's good to see you. Let me ask you this. If you had the ability, if you could make this decision, would Kabul become Korea and Germany for American troops? And was this something that you would have at least advocated for, that this would have been, yes, permanent stability forces were necessary? Would that have been where you would have come down on this if you could have made this decision unilaterally?
Well, we would have hoped in 2001 that it wasn't necessary. But the issue for the United States today, yesterday, tomorrow, is what protects American civilians and American national interests the best. And this is a hard decision. This has been a protracted struggle. But let's be very, very clear. We went into Afghanistan. We have stayed in Afghanistan not to protect Afghans, but to protect Americans. And this military withdrawal and the withdrawal of all the other American agencies that are affected by it, I think risks very grave danger to American national security. Let me be clear as well. This is not a partisan point, because if Donald Trump had been reelected, I think he would be doing exactly what Joe Biden is doing. It's a mistake across the board, and I very much fear we're going to feel the consequences in the not too distant future.
Look, it isn't unpopular that American troops are still in Korea. It isn't unpopular that American troops are still in Germany. Public opinion, though, matters, right? And public opinion has turned on this war on, all sides of the spectrums here. This isn't one of our bubble issues where one side's living in one bubble and one side's living in another. Is this the fault of political leaders not articulating what the mission is? Because I do think when it was articulated as a mission to somehow promote democracy, a lot of people said, good luck. This is a country that is a couple of centuries behind.
Yes. Well, I never believed it was a mission for democracy in Afghanistan. God knows I wish the people there well, but we're not there for their benefit. This is not a charity performance by the United States. We're there, as I said, to protect innocent American civilians from another 9/11. I do think that public opinion has turned against this war, and I blame it squarely on our political leadership. For at least the last 12 years, we have not had a president who articulated clearly the reason why we were there. We would all like to, quote unquote, win the war. Unfortunately, the disposition of terrorist forces in Afghanistan and many other parts of the world hasn't allowed that to happen. But the question is, would you rather protect against renewed terrorist attacks on the United States in places like Afghanistan, or would you rather try and do it in the streets and skies above America? I think if our political leadership had explained the nature of the mission, recognizing it was protracted, the American people would have understood it. That's how the American people understood the protracted nature of the American deployments in Germany and Japan to win the Cold War, which we did. And in fact, our troops are still there. When people explain the reason, and the reasons are good, the American people will support the disposition of American forces to protect them.
I want to go to the issue of the Taliban. Sometimes we treated the Taliban as an enemy, and sometimes we treated them as an entity to be negotiated with. These mixed messages perhaps it seemed to, I think, throw our military leaders for a loop at times, and perhaps it was being done to just forestall, any more attacks, whatever reason. But it seems as if how we dealt with the Taliban changed constantly, and that also made the mission a bit opaque.
Well, I think there's something to that. I mean, I think we understood on September the 12th that we faced an ideological foe of the United States and the West as a whole. And it has remained an ideological foe, although we don't acknowledge it. I think there are too many people in the United States and the West generally who don't see that this religious fanaticism in political form is just as much an ideological threat as the great threats we saw during the 20th century. It's very different, seems very medieval to us, but it's still an ideological threat. And I think if we had maintained a consistency of understanding that threat, it would have been easier and more logical to explain to the American people why we needed to continue to resist it through a military and intelligence presence in Afghanistan.
You know, another thing that military leaders and political leaders are telling me is, hey, look, the major threats to the security of the United States don't emanate from Afghanistan anymore. That doesn't say they may not in the future, but right now, our threats, you know, we've got more issues in Asia. We got more issues in cyber than we do with Al-Qaeda or ISIS, and therefore we're going to have to prioritize our resources into those areas. What do you say to that rationale?
Well, I think that's a self-licking ice cream cone. If you only have so many resources and you have more threats than the resources can cope with, you're not going to do very well. The United States obviously has to face the threat of China in Asia and around the world. It is the existential threat of the 21st century, but it doesn't mean the threat of terrorism, the threat of nuclear proliferation, other threats have disappeared. And we have new threats like cyber. We can do all of these things. We can defend the United States. What are we good for if we can't defend the United States against these threats? By the application of adequate resources. And they're out there.
Do you feel as if, though, I mean, another argument that's been made to me is, look, 20 years ago, we didn't have the surveillance technology we have today. 20 years ago, we didn't have the drone technology that we have today. We're really good at this counterterrorism stuff. And, you know, we don't have to be in country in the numbers we've been in order to manage it. Is that realistic?
That is ridiculous. The idea that you can have an effective presence, not just to deal with the terrorist threat in Afghanistan, but to watch what's going on to the west in Iran, to worry about Pakistan, which in the face of a Taliban-controlled Afghan government will be more susceptible itself to being taken over by radical Islamicists who would then have control of a substantial stock of nuclear weapons, requires being there, requires being on the ground. Doing it at long distance is much less effective, and the idea now we're going to try and do it from the Persian Gulf region or Central Asia is a very poor substitute for being present in sufficient numbers inside Afghanistan.
Well, Ambassador, I feel like this is a divide that's among the foreign policy elite like yourselves. To the American public, this is just, oh, why are we still there at the end of the day? And, and ultimately, if you don't have the political will, go ahead.
I have one thing to say about that. September the 11th, 2001. To risk that happening again, which is very much what I think we're doing, is national security malpractice. I just hope to God I'm wrong.
Former Ambassador and former National Security Advisor John Bolton, appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective with us, sir. Nice to talk with you.
Thanks for having me.